To kick off the panel, let's see, I think we could turn the cameras on here for our three panelists. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them all one by one and go into a little bit more about who they are and what they do. And so we will start that off with Neha Joshi, Growth and Strategy and Innovation Lead for Accenture Security. So welcome, Neha.
Thank you, Juan.
Neha, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what you do in that role of Growth and Strategy and Innovation Lead there at Security.
So I've been leading innovation for about a year now, and now we've added the growth and strategy component just in the last few weeks. I'll talk more about the innovation side. Really what we do is within Accenture Security, we're really thinking about how can we use innovation at sort of the heart of everything we do, of how we serve our clients. And really what I've focused on is guiding through what are the really most complex areas that we want to focus in on and solve for, so that we can then help our clients. And that of course includes investment, nurturing those ideas so that we can really grow them out.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we'll look forward to having the discussion with you. We also have with us here today Jennifer Quarrie, COO and Strategy Director for Mach 37 Cyber Accelerator. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you for having me today, Juan.
So Jennifer, can you tell us just a little bit about Mach 37?
Sure. Mach 37 is a cyber accelerator. We launch early stage startups into the market. Essentially, we look at seed stage and early stage startups. We look across hundreds, if not thousands, of different startups in all areas of cyber. We take the cream of the crop. We run them through a 90-day, mini MBA type of pressure testing program. And then we host a large launch day, and we also facilitate their growth onward even after they graduate. So we've built a nice community over the years. Mach was established by the state of Virginia in 2013, and now our company VentureScopes owns and operates it here in Tysons.
Great, thank you. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Allison Ann Williams, who is the founder and CEO of Unveil. Welcome, Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Juan. Glad to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Unveil and some of the work that you do there?
So Unveil is a data security company. We focus completely on securing data in use, when it's being used and processed to enable secure and private data search, sharing, analytics, collaboration. So for example, we can do things like take searches or analytics or machine learning models, going back to our keynote, encrypt them, and then run them anywhere our software is installed without ever decrypting them at any point during processing. So that's powered by breakthroughs in a special type of encryption called homomorphic encryption, often considered to be that holy grail in the family of privacy enhancing technologies, which we can talk about later, because that really fundamentally is changing the game for how organizations can securely and privately leverage data assets.
And that was homomorphic technologies?
Homomorphic encryption. Yes, you pronounced it correctly.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here today. So I want to kick things off by maybe addressing the big elephant in the room, right? The pandemic, and how this might be impacting the cybersecurity industry and maybe the work that you guys are doing specifically. So maybe we'll start with Jennifer over at Mach 37. What are you seeing as an impact that the pandemic is having on you and your companies?
Well, and I think there are more cyber startups than ever. I think just, by virtue of the industry itself, but the pandemic has really shown a spotlight on the necessity. As you know, there have been a variety of hacks into big systems. Everyone's gone virtual, and what everyone probably should have been paying a little bit more attention to it now is something and people can't ignore. And so, with anything, when you have a lot of attention and resources directed towards something, all of a sudden you've got a lot more players. And so we're seeing a lot of big organizations paying more attention, putting more resources, time, dollars towards figuring out solutions, and a lot of people who were in the startup community already getting funding, even though things are tight in terms of venture right now. We're seeing a lot more investment. I think we're going to continue to see that trend. And then, of course, we have people who have some solutions who say, I can solve this very quickly, looking at starting startups. So we're seeing at every level of business right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd imagine it's a boom time for the industry in that respect. Neha, what about at Accenture? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're a professional services organization. So we do consulting, outsourcing, that type of work. And so we've seen, for our clients, we see kind of two things. One is an increase in attacks, right? We have a new attack surface with everything moving virtual. And we also see different types of attacks. So as an example, we've seen phishing attacks kind of have a resurgence. They were sort of had been on the decline for some time, but we're seeing a very significant increase in that again. And what we thought about is when we looked at how we've seen the trends, initially a lot of the work was really about how can we help everyone safely move to cloud, move remote, support that remote workforce. And I think we're going to see a continuation of that. We're seeing that, even in the more recent months where we, have that cloud movement, because, the initial thing was like, let's just get everyone out. And then now it's like, okay, all of our systems really need to move to the cloud. How do we continue to evolve that sort of in the more longevity aspect of that? But we've also seen an increase in security operations work, and also more of a, in general, we've had more of a focus right now on technology and less on maybe more strategic advisory work. I think we're going to see that change as we kind of come out of this. And we'll expect the cloud, application security, identity security to remain top priorities. But I think we're going to see more of an increase on that security operations work, as well as that incident response type of work.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And from a consumer's perspective, the phishing scams that have been hitting my inbox recently have been insane. So yeah, I could see that getting a pickup. Ellison Ann, how about at Unveil?
So one of the umbrella use cases that we most often solution for, and I touched on just a second ago, is in enabling that secure data sharing and collaboration. And historically, we've seen that manifest most often in the vertical of financial services, even though secure data sharing and collaboration is very horizontal. And in financial services, the impetus for that was really enabling different jurisdictions to be able to share data in a way that respected the privacy and secrecy regulations of those jurisdictions. So we are seeing that right now, the interest in it move from financial services and start to blossom over in healthcare, where due to COVID, there is a global rise in the need to have a complete and enriched health picture of an individual or an entity.
Yeah, and as far as, some of you had mentioned some of the threats that are going out there because of, maybe they've been highlighted because of COVID, but what are some of the other just big cybersecurity challenges maybe that we've been seeing in the past couple of years, or that we expect to see in the coming years? And I'll open this to anybody.
I'll take a jump at that one. I mean, there are a number of them, but I think sort of what Ellison was referring to is going to be interesting, where you have a lot of industries that have closed systems. Finance tends to be very locked down, healthcare tends to be very locked down, and then you have industries that are inherently open, that have to have very global transient data sets. And so one of the questions is going to be, how do you work and let those systems touch and allow sort of that data to remain secure at every place. So, you're talking data in transit, data at rest, conglomerations of data. Then you also have sort of the semantic part of data manipulation, right? Anyone who's taken statistics realizes you can sort of make data say anything. I think actually that's going to be a really interesting part. It's sort of like the deep fake version of data. I think will sort of be something that people are going to be looking at in the future. But then the other thing I think I would say is, when you're looking at identity, even if it's, digital identity or any identity, veracity of data is going to be huge, particularly as people stay online. If there's a trend right now for people to stay at home working going forward, there's going to be a lot more data. There's going to be a lot more digital identity questions in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Neha, Ellison Ann, any other challenges that you guys are seeing?
I would add two more that are kind of more sort of less technology focused, and kind of more of how do we think about risk and security from a kind of a bigger scale. The first is really around cyber resilience across an entire business value chain, right? So if you look at factories or partner ecosystems, they're very, very interconnected, and they're becoming even more so. So the weakest link in that supply chain can actually increase exposure for all, right? So thinking about that, and how do you, and that's, I think, we say that the kind of cybersecurity challenges, that's one that to me really comes to mind. The other is really thinking about connected devices, which we just see the proliferation of it when we think about Industry X.0 and how we have, different, more and more devices being connected, and what that means when you think about cars. To me, is always the scary example of
Yeah.
what could happen, right? And how do we actually protect that and make sure that we are thinking about that in a secure way from the beginning all the way to the end? Again, bringing back that value chain. And then OT, so operational technology. We've always thought a lot more about IT security versus OT security in the industry, and thinking about how do we secure manufacturing, secure IP, secure medical devices, even oil rigs, right? And how do we actually patch those types of devices as they're they're in use and they really can't have downtime, right? So how do you think about those as well?
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you have any more of an example, like an OT security situation that maybe you guys have worked on?
Yeah, so I can't necessarily explain the ones that we've
Sure.
actually worked on, but I can kind of generally what are some of the things that we've seen. So when we look at an oil rigs is one that people are always like, oh, what do you mean by that, right?
Yeah.
So you think about an oil rig like out in the middle of the ocean, and it has technology running on it, right? And how do you patch those servers? How do you update those? And who does that? Right. So thinking about how that process is done, and historically, in in the industry, that hasn't necessarily been done to the same level as it's been done for IT. Same thing around medical device security, right? When you think about how are we actually thinking about the security around the medical devices, both in manufacturing those, as because the manufacturing of those devices is again part of that process. It's an OT process, but as well as in usage, right? So when they're actually in use in a human body, you can't have downtime to go patch something, right?
Yeah.
And how do you recognize a threat that's actually coming to that device, and how do you react to that? What do you do to actually respond and detect, and then actually take that action that's needed to make sure that you protect the human life that's associated with it, as well as then take the action for the device itself.
Yeah. Wow, fascinating. Ellison Ann, how about you? Obviously, Unveil has a little bit of a specific focus there, but are you seeing any other sort of big threats, challenges, whether it's recently or that you see coming down the road?
Well, we can't get on an airplane, so that's certainly been a challenge, but everybody else is in the same position. In terms of the challenges, they're not specifically COVID related. They would be accelerated by COVID.
Sure.
We are seeing this rise in the global demand for privacy, which is trickling down in the regulations. So we are very focused on making sure people can still get their business done. So being business enabling and still comply with everything they need to comply with. I will offer, going back to a couple of questions ago, one of the things that we are seeing in terms of acceleration that we're very happy about is the acceleration toward cloud adoption. So we have some very specific cases where we were supposed to be now deploying in various jurisdictions around the world on-prem in certain customers' environments that now, due to COVID, they've accelerated their cloud adoption, and now we're doing that remotely in their cloud environments within those jurisdictions. So I think that's a huge benefit and a huge win for cloud adoption, but of course there are a lot of security implications associated with just locking down the cloud environments themselves that go beyond our software and what we provide as a company.
Yeah. And are you working with any other industries around that idea, around cloud adoption issues?
In terms of cloud adoptions, we partner with all the major cloud providers, AWS and GCP and Azure, and deploy natively in those spaces. So we really work with them and look to them to secure their own environments. And we are we're a pure software company. So we deploy software in those environments and respect the security controls that are in place.
Gotcha. Okay. What about some exciting new technologies that you're seeing? And Jennifer, you might see some there at Mach 37, but for all three of you, what new exciting technologies in cybersecurity are you seeing out there, whether it's within your own organizations or from other companies?
Well, we certainly do see a lot of really fantastic technology come through the startups. I think that's one of the best parts of working in, sort of the innovation industry and in startups in general. Quantum is a big one. It's sort of emerging a little bit more in the startup world. Originally, it was sort of relegated to academia and the big institutions that could manage the quantum computing. And now we're seeing startups in earnest, come out with some really good solutions. And we're hoping, that there'll be real players at the table in that. And that will change the industry completely, right? PKI will no longer work, right? And that type of encryption will be dead. And that changes data forever. And so, ensuring that that the data is quantum resilient is something that basically we should be doing now. So that's something that I think we're seeing that's really exciting, that we didn't expect to see necessarily out of the startup world quite as soon as it has emerged.
So quantum computing is really sort of accelerated lately with everything that's going on. Is that anything that you guys are seeing activity around, Neha?
We are seeing some of it. I wouldn't say as much for me in the startup space necessarily. I think for some of the kind of emerging side that definitely we're seeing a lot of work in quantum. But I think what I've seen in terms of from, what we're seeing startups, innovators try to do, there's two areas. One is the use of AI, which we heard a lot about with Dr. Saurav. I think it's, there's so many different things, really going back to what Dr. Ellison was saying, is it's not necessarily it's how do we use all that data that we have. And when you think about security, we tend to get inundated with data. We have so much transactional information and so much data on our organizations and the people in them and how they're using our systems. How do we actually make sense of that? And I've seen so many really cool things that are happening with AI, using that to make clear who should have access to what in an organization, creating threat simulation graphs, having threat intelligence that from various different sources to pull that together. We're also seeing a lot where we're looking at how can we quantify risk. So taking and risk, meaning that more broadly. So cybersecurity, yes, technical, geographical, human risk, taking that all together and making that digestible for C-suites and for boards. And this is an area I really would love to see evolve even more, but I think there's some really interesting things happening around both those spaces.
Great. And Ellison, anything else in terms of exciting new technologies or innovations?
Well, what we are seeing is the resurgence of that family of technologies that I mentioned earlier, often called privacy enhancing technologies, or PETs. Sometimes in the UK and the EU, or privacy preserving computation or technology, sometimes here in the US. And this terminology in the family of technologies that fall under that umbrella. So homomorphic encryption is one, secure multi-party compute is another, trusted execution environments or enclave technology is another. They are not new technologies, but they've experienced recent breakthroughs that now allow them to be very practical and usable from a business enablement standpoint. So we're seeing a real resurgence in that. And again, privacy enhancing technologies, they're just a family of technologies that really enable and preserve privacy throughout that processing life cycle. So that usage portion of what I like to refer to as the data security or privacy triad, where you've got data at rest on the file system and the database, or access control provisions fall into that category. And then you've got data in transit when it's moving around through the network. And then finally, what happens to that data when it goes to be used or processed.
Yeah, and I think as somebody had mentioned earlier, right, the securitizing of that data allows business to happen. And right now we need business to happen more than ever. So a lot of this is getting a lot of attention, and we're seeing a few discussions out there about the future of cybersecurity and the importance of artificial intelligence and machine learning, as Dr. Mandel mentioned earlier. What are you seeing around those two topics, AI and ML?
I can go first, so Jennifer doesn't have to keep going first. I think, one of the things that I think is really interesting in the AI space is that by its nature, all the conditions and the outcomes aren't known. So I love that we're using AI and machine learning to enhance how we respond to cybersecurity threats and how we detect them. One thing that I think is a new challenge that poses is how do we then secure the AI itself, right? So how do we, because as I said, it's nature, it's that you don't know its conditions. You don't know, you can't demonstrate them necessarily.
Right.
So you have to think about both in creation and in usage of those AI models. what actually happens, right? In creation, it's both the data that we use to train it and the environments that we use, right, for that creation. And then in usage, it's looking at the data that could taint the model, right? If we've seen that there's been so much news of those types of threats that have happened. And I think Twitter was a really good example, not the most recent one, but another one that happened, where you can train an AI model to respond inappropriately. But think about that on a greater scale that could have much farther implications beyond just reputation of an AI based Twitter account, right? And then also protecting the return information. How do we actually do that in a way that doesn't get tainted, so that we're able to actually have the results that you would expect from those models? So that's an area that I think is a bit unexplored for an end-to-end process. There's pieces of it, but how do we look at it sort of end-to-end to make sure that we're actually really securing that AI and that machine learning that happens?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll hop in there. Model governance is a whole field in and of itself in terms of quality and model maintenance and things like that. And so we've approached the aspect of that deals with some of what Neha was saying, which is how do you make sure that the models themselves, which are typically vulnerable, if you look at a lot of different ways that you can kind of reverse engineer those models and get back to the data that it was trained on, which could be regulated, protected, sensitive, et cetera. And valuable because they're often considered IP. How do you make sure that those are protected during that evaluation that she was describing, and making sure that the results themselves are also protected during that life cycle? So there's a whole field of privacy preserving machine learning that's out there. And of course, we're solutioning in that as well.
In addition to the data, I think a lot of the outcomes are sort of a little bit different. On most of I think a large percentage of the startups that go through Mach 37 are actually AI technologies, and they're in all sorts of different sectors because cyber is that horizontal. But one of the sort of I guess unifying factors is the idea that we're taking more and more sort of people out of the loop a little bit. We're saving time on things that we weren't doing before, right? Dr. Mandel was just saying, right, being able to convert one type of code to another. I mean, I was a programmer that got to reprogram things back in the day when we had to move it out of C, right? And so when you look at how AI is doing that, the amount of time we're saving in terms of discovering new algorithms to do a lot of the functions that we're looking for, or identifying bottlenecks, or doing these security alerts that Neha had been mentioning. I think that is it's going to change the nature of how we operate in terms of a system, in terms of our culture, our reliance on it, but as well as being able to divert human thinking and human management towards other areas, right? And that's sort of a really cool part of innovation, in the sense that you have AI innovating, right, generating algorithms and things like that, and then it frees humans to also innovate as well, right? And yes, you definitely need someone keeping the shop, that kind of thing, but it allows you to divert resources in new ways that we haven't been able to before.
Yeah, fascinating. One thing that we're also hearing a lot about, which is 5G. There's a lot of talk about 5G. Are you running into any companies that are playing in that technology, Jennifer?
Yes, there are a number that are sort of looking at that. It's a little bit of a sort of divisive topic, I guess you could say, in some regards, because a lot of the folks looking at cybersecurity, particularly in DC area, are looking to get into the US market and get US investors. And there's been some legislation that sort of disincentivizes investment, particularly out of China and things like that. It's a little bit hard for some of these companies to know sort of where to go for investment and things like that. So 5G is definitely an issue, but and we're seeing folks trying to figure out how everything's going to play out and where that technology should fit in. Who's going to end up using some of the Huawei type of technology and things? Who's going to be able to come to the table and compete? And then what are the things that could be differentiators that will allow someone to then take over versus Huawei or that kind of thing? So it feels like a very competitive landscape right now, and there's so many unknowns that people are just kind of placing bets and really just kind of feel things out. So I haven't seen a lot of forward, a lot of speeding down the highway. Everyone's still sort of like just testing the waters, at least from the startup standpoint. I don't know if you're seeing other things in larger organizations.
Yeah, how's the discussion around 5G impacting maybe some of your clients at Accenture, Neha?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So the handout that we've shared in this session has kind of some of the highlights we've seen. And I think what's really interesting is we surveyed all these different organizations on how much they're adopting emerging technologies, and then how much they're investing in securing those, right? And those two numbers are not the same. So, we saw things like where the adoption was very high, up to like 87% by some of these groups. And we saw, over the last 3 years, there was, I think about a third of them had spent over 500 million on these new technologies, and that includes AI, 5G, quantum, and extended reality. But then the securing them was much lower. I mean, almost half, right? And so when you think about so I think and we've seen this before. This is not, it's like these are not the doors you're looking for. We've seen this, right? This has happened in security. It happens all the time, and it's like we don't learn from those mistakes. When you think about DevSecOps, to get that sec in the middle of that took so long as to be kind of just the common way we spoke. And I feel like the same thing kind of can happen with some of these more emerging technologies. We have to close that gap of what do we think about? How do we invest in really securing these technologies? When we talk about 5G specifically, there's legacy issues as we move from the old networks to 5G that we sometimes carry over with us. There's new issues with some of the new features that it brings forward, right? Like virtualization and location tracking. That comes back to the privacy that we were talking about earlier from Alice and Ann. And also looking at volume. So you're increasing the volume and increasing the speed. That means that you're introducing new types of vulnerabilities as well, because you're having greater uptake of things like image and video, right? So how does that then compensate? So I think it's really looking at that ability to bring those things together in terms of adoption and securing it. What we talk about is how do we do that, right? So you want to think about investing in that protection, building the skills in your workforce now, as well as partnering where you need to, where you have gaps, so that when you think about how you secure, yes, go 5G if that's what you need to do for your business and that's the right thing to do, but make sure you're securing it as you go, because you don't want to come back later and do it. It's much harder.
Right.
Neha, do you see people asking, assuming that adopting the technology is securing it? Right? Like, I think I run into that a lot. Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, it happens all the time, right? I think I think people naturally assume that newer technologies are more secure because there's such a heightened awareness of security. And so you think as new technologies come, they must have that security kind of embedded in it. I can understand that assumption, but we need to, as an industry, we need to make sure, and as practitioners, we need to make sure that we are dispelling that myth very quickly, or making it true, which is even better, right? Let's make it true.
And just to jump in quickly, one of the interesting things that we've seen in the journey of creating this new market around securing the usage of data is that even though fundamentally it's data security and encryption powered software, it is not the situation where you're locking down something that already exists. In fact, securing the usage of data is actually business enabling. It opens up different types of business functionality and use cases that were never possible before. So it's the case of security enabling privacy, enabling business functionality, instead of the other way around, where you have it in place and then you look around and go, oh my goodness, how am I going to lock this down? Very different.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider there, and I just want to point out real quick that there is a handout that Neha mentioned earlier, and it is on I guess it would be on this side of your screen. You can see 3 handouts there, one with more information on all of the panelists and our speakers today, and then 2 there from Accenture, including the one that Neha mentioned that had a lot of that information. So we were talking about the securitization of data. How do we balance that with access? So for example, we've got quantum computing. Not every small startup or not every client project may have access to quantum computing the way the Amazons, the way larger companies do. How do we balance that?
Well, I'll take a shot at that one. I mean, there's never been equity there in any technology, unfortunately. And so I think part of that is deciding, maybe to do partnerships and things like that to scale some of those things. Like we were saying earlier, your weakest link, you're all as strong as your weakest link, right? So if you do have multiple systems that are connected, then you need everyone to pretty much agree to adopt. And so making that readily available helps everyone, secures yourself. And so, I think we will probably see infrastructure, government, things like that, looking to behave that way, particularly because they have so many tentacles everywhere. But the other way to look at it is not just quantum, it's also how we look at data. So, some of the really cutting edge solutions we've seen come through are sort of looking at data not as pieces of full information, but as bits, and encrypting those individually. So it may be able to get to a point where you're secure. A hacker would have to hack and hack and hack to get one bit, and who wants to spend all that effort for a small amount of information? And so sometimes maybe the approach itself might be able to be a little bit more ubiquitous and not necessarily require, quantum level, technology and things like that. But I do expect a lot of those algorithms and a lot of those things to become well adopted. And so I think the speed is only getting faster in terms of what's going to be available and what people are going to begin to adopt, particularly when it comes to encryption.
And I think to add to that, I think it's important for organizations to understand that whether or not they adopt quantum, there are risks to their organizations, right? So the introduction of quantum technologies means that a lot of the models that they have depended on, so even protecting their own data, a lot of it's based really underlies on a random number generator, which is going to be broken like that, right? So, and thinking about, there's been a lot of expectation that, because there's a various different technologies here, so we need to make sure that we're staying agile, staying portable on what we do, but all of the expectations around when quantum would break certain things have been beat so far. The idea was that the NIST standard is supposed to be released in 2024. We're already expecting that you need quantum cryptography much earlier than that, right? So organizations need to be thinking about that. And I would echo what Jennifer said in terms of thinking about partnerships to help with that, either from a software perspective, professional services, whatever it is you need. Again, figure out for your organization what's required to help you to make sure that you are, a battering down the hatches and protecting yourself as that's coming.
Ellis and Ann, any thoughts on that equitable access of information and technology?
Well, from a startup perspective, I mean, if we want to stick on the quantum topic, from a startup perspective that's selling encryption software, we're certainly making sure that our products are modular in their encryption and that they can leverage and do leverage quantum resistant forms of crypto. So we go ahead and get ahead of that curve for the customer in terms of what products are inserting in their environment. In terms of access, this goes back to what I was talking about before in the rise of that family of PETS technologies, that it's enabling that global access to data without having to move the data around, which is very key when you start talking about respecting all of those regulatory requirements. And in terms of specific things like access control, that's always going to be in there in the at-rest bucket, and we make sure as well, people should just generally, that those access control provisions are respected at every point during that life cycle.
Right. We are going to jump over here to a Q&A in just a little bit. If anybody has any questions for any of our panelists, or we're going to bring Dr. Mendel back here in just a minute, please enter them in the questions side that is also in that sidebar control panel. So I'll have a kind of talk a little bit more about the future. 5 years from now, based on everything that you're seeing now, we've got a few founders here on the webinar who are looking at cybersecurity opportunities in the future, investors who have an interest in where cybersecurity is going. So think 5 years from now, right? We're over the pandemic. What do we think the what do we think the industry is going to look like? What is the cybersecurity industry going to look like in 5 years?
Well, that's an easy one for me to answer because I just answered that for the World Economic Forum. So we were announced and chosen, a couple weeks ago as a 2020 World Economic Forum technology pioneer. Super big honor because only 6 cybersecurity companies in the world chosen, and we were the only one solutioning around privacy enhancing technologies to secure the usage of data. And they asked me exactly the same question: what do you see is going to happen in 5 years?
Yeah.
And the prediction was around the ubiquity of the global demand and solutioning for privacy. It's going to change everything. It's going to change the way that we do business because the backbone of the digital economy is data. And so if there are regulatory requirements around these pieces of data or around the majority of our data in terms of privacy implications, that really changes how you build whole suites of cybersecurity products or security products in general. So I think that's going to be a huge driving force in the next 5 years. And of course, I believe that privacy enhancing technologies will also be ubiquitous.
Of course. Neha, what do you think the future looks like?
Yeah, I think, kind of going back on, I have to depend on my colleagues here who've done this handout that you're seeing as the, what are we seeing as the emerging technologies and then the security implications of those, right? So we're talking about AI, 5G, quantum, and extended reality. The one we didn't really talk about here is extended reality. So I'll touch on that for a minute.
Sure.
So with extended reality is sort of is virtual and augmented reality. Augmented is kind of like it includes like haptic and olfactory. So think of like Ready Player One. That's what I always think of. And the fact that it's stored in the cloud, it uses AI, has the same kind of similar implications as what we think of today for those. But there's a lot of privacy to echo Allison and privacy implications. And then there's also about another set of risks around impersonation and tampering those results that could result in some severe actions, right? If we're dependent on people using extended reality for their jobs, for training, for things like doing a surgery or something like that, you can imagine the implications of tampering with some of that. So I'll just add that as another one, because I think we've touched on some of the others.
Great. Jennifer.
I think the only thing I'd add, and this may be biased, is I hope that it's a little bit more of a sort of an all community approach to cyber. I think in the past, cyber has been relegated to the technologists or the security people, and everyone who takes their organizational training in cyber will say, oh yes, we're all need to have some cyber knowledge and things like that. But I think cyber in general is going to increasingly become sort of this skill set that we all need to have, as part of what we do. And as a result, I think it doesn't have to be just the big firms who are experts in it. It's going to be, how do we get everyone in the ecosystem to partner? And we're part of some great partnerships in the DC ecosystem. CCI is one where we've got all the academic institutions who have the new R&D coming out, partnering with the big organizations who are hiring and need certain skill sets, partnering with the venture folks who are saying, what should we invest in? What do we need down the road? Partnering with the startups who say, we have products that can change your world now. And so, we have all these players that are very separate worlds, and all of that really needs to come together. And I think these demands that are coming out of COVID and some of these other major, the election, things like this, are forcing people to have these conversations and realize, oh my gosh, we're trying to solve the same problems. Having a little bit more partnership across our entire community, I think, will allow us to move faster. And in cyber, unfortunately, that speed is of the essence. I think business is the same way. The startups are helped us recover from the last few recessions for that reason, because they were allowed to see the problems and solve them faster than some of the big organizations could move. And so we should leverage the strengths of everyone in the ecosystem, allow people who can move fast to move fast, and then act as support systems to get those solutions in place. And sort of that rising tide lifts all boats. So that's my vision for 5 years from now. I hope that comes true.
No, that's great. I love it. Very, very communal, very optimistic.